Hello, my name is Zane Siebenek. I am a student at the wonderful Truman State University, and today I'm going to be going over a paper I wrote called The Birds and the Bears, Changes in Behavior and Interaction Between Ursus maritimus and Arctic Bird Species in Response to Climate Change for Bio 210. So first off, I'll talk a little bit about climate change. Climate change is, as it says in the name, a change in climate that's progressively been happening over time. And it's been happening in almost every region of the world. What happens is a lot of these ecosystems get warmed up and they have certain changes in their local environment. And this affects a lot of the species that live in these regions, and they have to sort of adapt and change their behavior in response to these changes to better survive. One example of this comes from the Atlantic Ocean, where a bunch of marine life lives, whether it be microscopic or fish. And a study from Polexanska has found that a lot of these species have actually been moving in a northern direction to higher latitudes in response to a lot of the warmings of these temperatures within the ocean. And whether this be because of certain autonomic factors, where they better survive under certain temperatures, or perhaps maybe prey is moving and they're following that sort of prey. When these species move, it causes a number of problems for both themselves and other species surrounding them. For themselves, they have to adapt to a whole new environment. If they move higher, things aren't going to be exactly the same as they were down below. And down below, the species that didn't move also have to adapt, because now one of their potentially large food sources, or a species that they maybe had sort of a beneficial interaction with, is now gone. So they have to change their behavior in response to this missing fish. Now, I talked a lot about the Atlantic, but these changes are not exclusive for just the Atlantic, and what I'll actually be talking about today is one of these such behaviors in the Arctic, which is also rapidly changing due to climate change. So what is the Arctic? The Arctic is an ecosystem that resides in areas like Canada and Alaska and parts of Russia that has seasonal changes in ice. During certain seasons, the ice extends over the water and then it warms up and the ice melts, and a lot of species retreat to the mainland. This ice is unfortunately very sensitive to temperature, which is also unfortunate because studies have shown that temperature is actually rising in the Arctic. Over the past century, it has actually risen a whole degree Celsius, which has caused a number of cascading problems. Ice coverage has gone down by 2.7% with a standard deviation of 0.5 since the 1980s. And the estimated length of snowfall has also gone down, but it's changed in such a way that since the snowfall is shorter, there's actually been a larger mass of snow that's landed in the area, which may also cause problems for other species. Now, these factors relate to the air temperature, but a study found by Post and Marshall has found that, or two various studies, found that sea level is actually rising because of some of the melting due to air temperature, which gets pushed into the ocean, and the ocean circulates. It makes the ocean circulate at a more rapid pace, which circulates even more warmer water, and almost a cycle of warming, which will prove to be a big problem in the future if that continues. But all these changes in the ice, and this slow shrinking, and the changes in the air temperature, have impacted a lot of the species within these regions. And I will specifically talk about the Arctic shorebirds and the polar bears and how they are affected by these changes. So here's a picture here to show an example of this slow decline in the ice coverage. This is from Parkinson. You may be able to see that this is by month in 2 different seasons of the year, that as time goes along, the ice coverage has actually gone down, and by that 2.7% that I expressed earlier. So one group of species affected by this slow shrinking of the ice are actually shorebirds. There are 50 different species of birds that permanently live in Arctic regions, but the majority of birds that inhabit these regions actually come at various different times for breeding and mating. And so they're migratory and head over to these areas. And these birds have gone through a lot of changes because of the changing climate. Arctic shorebirds are actually migrating earlier into the season than they previously were. And this could be cause for a whole variety of reasons. But the large one that I found is that a lot of the arthropods, of which they feed on and they have their kin feed on, is also the peak abundance of these arthropods are happening sooner. So perhaps in response to the changing of the arthropods, the birds reacted to come and feed sooner on this. There's also more abundant sources of prey, more northern in the areas. So it's also been observed that a lot of these birds are moving up further whenever they do migrate, because prey availability in their old habitats have been observed to go down. So other than responses to climate change, a lot of other things have affected the shorebirds that are not of their own doing. Their predation upon shorebirds has actually gone up from 35% to 70%, meaning that a lot of these nests would see a predator 35% of the time a few years back, whereas now they are being preyed upon 70% of the time. So this image right here shows a particular species of bird and how they've been reacting to both temperature and prey availability. And you might be able to see that the birds are heading up a little north in response to the higher abundance of this food source above as it relates to the air temperature on the very bottom. Along with the shorebirds, polar bears have also gone through many changes with the changing ecosystem as it relates to climate change. Polar bears, their diet typically consists of a lot of seals, majority seal diet. And the hunting areas in which they find these seals have slowly been shrinking, as stated earlier in the shrinking ice, which causes a lower availability of food to these bears, which would be a problem because these bears are quite mobile. They have to swim around to get from place to place a lot of the time because of these shrinking ice flows. It's actually found that these bears are forced to make longer swims as of lately. They have to make about 92-kilometer long swims to reach the mainland, whereas previously it was lower than that. And so, as a result of both of these combinations of lower availability of prey and longer swims, some bears have been observed to have a noticeable decline in body mass of, at max, up to 10% body mass loss. And the populations of these bears have gone down as a combination of all these various things. And some of them would drown because of energy deficiency, or they might just starve because of lack of access to food. However, when it comes time for ice to completely melt, when it starts warming up around these Arctic regions, polar bears go to the mainland, which is where there's solid ground as opposed to just frozen water. And this opens up a variety of different food sources, like berries and trash and some larger mammals. But lately, polar bears and shorebirds have been more frequently interacting. So, when polar bears go back to the mainland, predation of marine life becomes really hard, because how they normally hunt seals is they'll wait by a breathing hole that seals make on the ice so that they can breathe as they travel along, and then they pounce on them there, which is a pretty energy efficient way of catching this prey, as opposed to swimming out to catch them, which is what they would have to do from the mainland. Shorebirds are quite abundant on the mainland. As stated previously, there's hundreds of millions of different birds at any point in time during there. And so polar bears have been seen to approach these shorebird nests by a increasingly large amount as time goes by. It's increased by over 60% in the in the most recent years. Many of these encounters have actually led to the bears consuming eggs. They don't typically go after the birds themselves, because chasing after a bird is almost as hard on their energy as catching maybe seals swimming out in the water. So they prey on these eggs to get a little sustenance. The predation of these eggs has actually led to a decline in certain bird populations, and the birds have had to make up for this loss in population by visiting other colonies to recruit certain birds to come back so that they can replenish their numbers. Which, as this change keeps happening and things escalate and get worse and worse in the Arctic, these recruitment events may not be enough. So we'll have to see how each species is affected by the worsening of the Arctic. So here's a diagram from Propp and some other researchers about 3 different locations and how bird nests are, how many days out of a year they are encountering these polar bears. And as you can see, it's been on a steady rise, a big jump starting at around 2000. So what's really happening here? What's sort of like the big picture? The polar bears and the birds are a wonderful example of what's happening on a grander scale of the world. These new interactions are sort of detrimental to both species, and it's a new interaction that they have to encounter with one another, and they have to adjust to these sort of things, which will cause problems, and unless certain species can adapt, then they might suffer as a result. However, not all changes are necessarily bad, but we need to keep an eye on a lot of these changes that are happening due to climate change in the ecosystems. There are a lot of different interactions around the world. One such interaction, there's been new hybridizations of certain fish species also seen in the Atlantic. As said previously, a lot of these species are moving to different locations, and so they're making new species of fish which might take up a different prey or do a whole number of different effects on the landscape. So it's very important to keep an eye on these different interactions so that we can understand better how to help these ecosystems and the species most negatively impacted by climate change. It's important to conserve these ecosystems and to keep the public informed on any new dangers that could arise as a result of these new behaviors. And that's the presentation. Thank you for watching.